The first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita pinpoints the basic difficulties which a spiritual seeker may have to face in the long run, in spite of all the preparations that he might have made, with all his logical conclusions and sincerity of purpose. In the earlier stages of our aspirations, we do not fully realize the problems that are hidden deep, invisibly, in the other layers of our personality, not directly connected with our daily life. We have an unconscious personality, apart from the conscious one, limited to this bodily existence. And this unconscious level of ours is larger in its content than the little expression of it we visualize outside as this body and its social relations. There are fears of various types which keep us secretly unhappy, and many of the activities of life in the conscious level are attempts to brush aside these fears and imagine that they do not exist at all. We occupy ourselves so busily with works of various types as a kind of outlet for the counteractive powers against these fears, usually known in the language of psychology as defense mechanisms. We protect ourselves by certain psychic mechanisms we manufacture within ourselves. A kind of self-deception, we may say, finally. You see, the attitude of the ostrich, as they say, which is said to bury its head in the sand when it is threatened with any kind of fear outside, burying its head in the sand so that it may not see anything outside. And nothing is seen outside means nothing exists outside. This is not merely the ostrich's attitude, but perhaps the attitude of every human being when one is faced with insoluble difficulties. All these problems are in the unconscious level, they are not in the conscious level. It does not appear to us that they exist at all. We are comfortably placed in a sensory world wherein the senses are fed to surf it, and they keep us completely ignorant of the dangerous abyss through which we have to pass in the future stages of our life. We are brainwashed totally by the impetuous activities of the senses to such an extent that we cannot be aware of what is ahead of us, what can happen tomorrow to us. Because if we can be awakened to the fact of all things that are to be faced in the future, we may perish just now with the fear of it. And nature does not want anybody to perish like that. So she keeps everything secret. and lets out the cat one at a time and all things at the same time from her bag. Now, when the tremendous confrontation of the Mahabharata battle was there, staring at the face of the otherwise heroic Arjuna, what was unconsciously present in the human being that he was came out and spoke in its own voice. Fears which were otherwise unknown, undreamt of, manifested themselves as the only realities and gripped Arjuna with such power that his personality changed completely, and he was not the man that he was before. We can suddenly become a different personality in a moment if serious conditions overtake us. Just 1 second is enough to transform us into a different personality altogether. And it can be a personality of any kind, because we are everything inside us. Everything that is anywhere is also inside us. And anything can come out under a given condition. It all depends upon the particular button that is pushed. And there you have the genius coming up, as if we rub the lamp of Aladdin, which you hear of in the story of Arabian Nights. Great fears overpowered Arjuna's mind, and we are going to be overpowered with the similar fears. Whereas many of us are already in those circumstances. Doubts of various kinds harass our mind when we begin to tread the path of the Spirit, because of a basic misconstruing of the very meaning of the Spirit, which mistake we committed due to a lack of proper training in the art of living spiritual life. Emotional stirring up into an enthusiasm of life, love of God, due to the study of a scripture, a mystical text, or listening to the sermon of a master, cannot be regarded as a reliable support for all time to come. There must be a conviction which must go deep into our hearts, and as long as the head and the heart stand apart like two poles, north and south, there is the likelihood of this psychic apparatus getting out of order and throwing us in different directions as scattered pieces of our personality, so that we may lose everything, even the little that we had earlier. This is what they call the fall in the language of mysticism, religion and spirituality. This happens because we have not studied ourselves properly, and we had a wrong notion of ourselves based upon what we know about ourselves through sense perception and social relationship, etc. The doubts that occur to the mind later on, when you advance sufficiently in the path, can be many. But those that we have recorded in the first chapter of the Gita, as those that occur to the mind of Arjuna, are a few. He had few serious difficulties which he posed before Sri Krishna. All this preparation for a war, this battle which the seeking spirit engages itself in, confronting nature as a whole and society outside. Can this be a mistake on our part? This doubt can occur to our minds. Have I committed a blunder with no proper thought? When you grow older in age, these doubts can come to the mind. Is there not something different from what I am thinking just now? I have made an evaluation of human society, my relationship with human society and the world as a whole, and come to a conclusion that they are to be faced in a storm if it becomes necessary. They are to be subdued and thrown out, abandoned, put down for the purpose of the achievement of spiritual victory. But is this a proper attitude? Can we face in a war those things, those persons who have been our supports and in regard to whom we are certainly required to perform certain obligations? There is what is called ethics and morality. There is an etiquette and a goodness, a charitable feeling, all which is quite different from the spirit of battle and war with the atmosphere outside. Are we to be considerate, friendly, and accommodating with our relationships in the world of sense? Or are we to fight with them? What should be our spirit of attitude in relation to the world and human society? A spirit of accommodation is one thing, and a spirit of war is another thing. Are they to be completely put down with the power of our arms? Or can this attitude be a mistake on our side? So Arjuna put this question. Is this not a mistake? Are we expected to face our brethren, our nephews, our relations, our grandsire, our teachers, as if they are opponents? Is the world our enemy? Are we to treat human society as an unfriendly atmosphere? That is one difficulty. Secondly, if we are to set this example before other people, naturally we expect others also to follow the same example. The whole world will follow suit along this line, which will end in a chaos of entire society, a destruction of all human values, and a defeat of the very purpose of creation. Is this not a sin that we commit? Is also a doubt in the mind. And Arjuna put this question. Are we to create disorder in human society in the name of a so-called victory, in the name of an ideal that we have placed before ourselves, calling it dharma or justice? But there is another difficulty. Is it certain that we are going to win victory in this battle? The world is mighty enough and human society is very complicated. Are we sure that we are to be the winners? Or can it be the other way around? May we be overpowered by the powers of nature, or we may be destroyed by the ethics of society. Considering all these aspects of the situation, it appears to me, says Arjuna, that all this engagement of ours is a futile attempt. We have to think thrice before we take any step. And to me at least, it appears that there is a basic error in the entire outlook with which we have embarked upon this war. I shall do nothing, says Arjuna. Throws down the weapon of all effort and enthusiasm and aspiration, and reverts to the level of the ordinary human being of sentiments and sense-ridden satisfaction. The difficulties mentioned in a few words in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita are not ordinary jokes or mere stories told to us for our cajolement. These things are difficulties of human nature as such. It is not my difficulty or your difficulty. Anyone who is human shall have to pass through these stages. Who can ever gainsay that one does not think in terms of gains and losses in the light of one's relationship with the world outside and human society externally? We live and move and have our being in this complex of relationship with the world of nature outside and human relationships. Where does God come in here into this picture? The notion of God has also been a very frightening factor many a time in the history of human thought. And there have been as many ideas of God as there have been people in this world. There have been people who denied the very existence of such a thing as God, the very impossibility of the being of such a thing, because of the fact there are no proofs adequate enough to convince us of its existence. All our arguments are sensory arguments. The logic of philosophy is a phenomenal argument, and it cannot touch what you imagine to be a noumenon or a transcendent being, because the substantiation of the existence of a transcendent being cannot be achieved through the instrument of phenomenal reason. There have been people who have been totally agnostic, maybe or may not be. Even if it is there, it is something impossible for us to understand with the faculties with which we are endowed at present. But more serious difficulties are those which faced Arjuna's mind and which gradually creep into our own minds and keep us inwardly insecure and anxious. The anxiety of a spiritual seeker is due to the doubts as to the possibility of success in the spiritual path. Doubts concerning the correctness of the approach which one has taken upon oneself as the proper method. Doubts as regards the duties one owes to the world and to human society. And finally, doubts even concerning what will happen to oneself, taking for granted this realization take place. And these doubts are not ordinary difficulties. They are present perhaps in every one of us, in some measure, in some proportion. And nothing can be more frightening to the ego of the human being than to be told that God is all. And the experience of God means the abolition of anything that is other than God. Such an abolition no one expects and would keep that situation as far away from oneself as possible, postpone it to an indefinite future, and close one's eyes to such a possibility at all. What can be a greater fear than the fear of losing oneself, even if it be in the ocean of God Himself? You do not want to be drowned even if it be an ocean of nectar. Now, the sum and substance of the first chapter of the Gita is this much. A relinquishment of all effort, which originally was the spring of action of the seeking spirit. After years and years of spiritual practice, one may content oneself with being the very same person that one was many, many years back, and lead the little life of the man of the street, either due to incapacity or due to a total disillusionment. Here, if the problems that come before us have at the same time a sincerity of purpose in the heart of the seeker, the light of truth will light upon the whole personality of the seeker and will take him by hand along the right path. There are two types of spiritual seekers who may have to face the same problems, no doubt, but who will be taken along two different paths altogether on account of the nature of the clarity of their spirits and the sincerity of purpose with which they have started this adventure of spiritual life. When your search is sincere and 100% honest, notwithstanding that you have not properly understood things entirely, you will be taken care of by the powers that are in the world, and you will see light rising in the horizon, and a guru or a teacher or a master like Krishna will be there in front of you. And you will be placed in the context or juxtaposition of such a master by the very nature of the universe, by the very law of the universe, by the very justice of God Himself. And in the earlier stages, one may be reluctant even to receive the advice of the master fully. Even when you are face to face with a competent teacher, you may not be prepared to act upon that advice entirely. This happened to Arjuna also, a circumstance described in the very beginning of the second chapter. When the great teacher told him, this is unworthy and unbecoming attitude on your part, at this crucial moment of time, the retort of Arjuna was, I am sorry. However, I have decided that I have made a mistake and I am not going to take up arms. What is the good of all this bloody warfare, where everything is going to be destroyed? Everything is going to be swallowed up by the power of doom. Then the necessity arises for the teacher to take up the proper course of instruction and lead the disciple stage by stage. As I mentioned to you some time back, an experienced and a competent teacher understands the level of the mind of the student and takes his stand on that level. This is sometimes called the Socratic method of teaching. The teacher does not impose himself on the student, because a flowering of the bud of the mind of the student is essential. We cannot forcefully open it, and if it is done, it would not be a blossomed flower. Okay, says Krishna, I understand what you say. You have a fear that you may not be win victory. You may have other difficulties apart from this, namely the social catastrophe that may follow the destruction that is equivalent to any battle, and other things that you have mentioned. Now, any argument or any logical approach should take into consideration what is called the universe of discourse. The universe of discourse is a term in logic. You must know the field in which the reason is operating at any given moment of time, or it has to operate. You cannot jump into another field altogether different from the one in which the reason operates. You argue as a citizen of the world, a unit in human society, or you argue on the basis of your being a metaphysical unit. A metaphysical argument should not be employed to solve problems which are purely social and personal, too intimate, whereas material and physical. Similarly, purely social and economic arguments should not be employed in the description or understanding of metaphysical realities. Everything has to be taken in the level it is. And Arjuna made a mistake of mixing up the arguments. He was on the one hand fear struck with the possibility of death and destruction in war. He may die and he may lose everything. And the question of success or victory of war does not arise if that predicament is to take place. On the other hand, he had the fear of obloquy from society, the fear of committing sin by way of destruction of social solidarity, and he did not know what will happen to him after death on account of these errors that he has committed in the name of war. The metaphysical side of human nature is in a peculiar manner connected with our empirical nature. In the very beginning of the second chapter, these two sides are taken into consideration. Are we spiritual entities, metaphysical units, or social individuals? Empirical phenomena. What are we? From various angles, Sri Krishna tries to tackle this problem. The first point that he takes up for discussion is the basic essence of the human being. One of the fears is the fear of death. And this question is the first one that is taken up at the beginning of the second chapter. Do you die really? And is your fear a fear of death, which may overtake you in the process of the engagement of yourself in a battle or a war? The phenomenon of death is analyzed threadbare. Who dies? And what is the meaning of death? Death is generally regarded as destruction and total annihilation of something. Now, does it stand to reason to say that anything can be totally destroyed? And can this be an argument to entertain fear of any kind? Is there real destruction of anything? Now, destruction is the total annihilation of what is. And what is called the real. When something really exists, it cannot be called a phenomenon or a passing phase. A real thing cannot pass away, and that which passes away cannot be called the real. The real has to be, and therefore it is called real. The unreal cannot be, and therefore there is no necessity to entertain any kind of fear or doubt in regard to it. Either that which dies is real or unreal. We cannot have a third thing imaginable. Something dies, someone dies. Is that thing or that person real or unreal? Be very clear in your minds when you think of this nature of arguing. If you say that the thing that has died was real, then you are contradicting yourself, because if it had been real, it cannot be destroyed, there is no death for it. You have already declared that it is real, and the real cannot not be, and the unreal cannot be. Na sato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate satah. So, that which is real cannot be regarded as destructible. If you say that the thing that has died is not real, it is unreal, then there is no question of death. It has already been dubbed by you as unreal. A destruction of a non-existent thing is unthinkable. And a destruction of an existent thing also is unthinkable. Because that which is existent cannot be destroyed, and that which can be destroyed cannot be regarded as existent. And the non-existent, of course, cannot attract attention at all. So what is it that dies? The phenomenon of death is visible before our eyes on account of a mixing up of standpoints. This mixing up of standpoints is called, in Vedanta philosophical language, adhyasa, the superimposition of one thing on another thing. You read one meaning into another and that meaning into this, and so on and so forth. That which exists is not that which dies. And that which does not exist is not that which dies. And therefore, one cannot say what dies. The process of death is a process of transition, and it is not a destruction of anything. A change of condition is called death. It is a change or a transition that is required by the very law of the evolution of the universe. In fact, we die every moment. Every cell of our body changes constantly. And it is opined by biologists that after every 7 years we become entirely new personalities physically. All the cells of the body renew themselves in such a manner that we are totally new beings after 7 years. Not merely that, every day there is transformation, change, and we grow. We have grown from small babyhood to this adult condition of today. But we have never seen how we have grown. This process of growing was very imperceptible, and if growth is nothing but change, how is it that it could not be perceived and we never knew that we were becoming something else every moment of time? All change is perceptible, visible, and recognizable. But in our own case of growth, for instance, we never knew, we could not recognize, we never felt that we were changing. Because there is something in us which does not change. The character of this particular mysterious entity in us, which does not change, has been superimposed by adhyasa upon that condition we call change. Change is only a condition and not a substance. It is not a thing. It is not a reality. Therefore, but it appears as if some tremendous event takes place at the time of death for all our practical purposes. We are horrified at the very name of death. The horrific nature of death is due to the identification of characters belonging to two levels of our being: the spiritual or the metaphysical, the temporal or the transitional. The one thing is connected with the other. When we say that there is death or destruction, we see two things at the same time, imagining that it is one thing and not constituted of two different things. There is a procession of events, a continuous change of process, charged with the unitary indivisibility of being, which is our basic essentiality. We call it Atman, we call it the soul or the self, we call it consciousness, etc. There is an indestructible element in us. and that has got mixed up with the condition of change which infects everything that is finite, and we are included in the world of finites. The bodily individuality of ours and even the psychic isolation of ours is a character of our finitude. The finite struggles to align itself with the infinite to which it really belongs. And the struggle of the finite to move towards the infinite is the whole story of evolution. Any change, any transformation, any movement whatsoever, anywhere in this world at any time, is a consequence of this impulse from the finite. Any movement whatsoever, anywhere in this world at any time, is a consequence of this impulse from the finite in the direction of the infinite. And no one can remain as a finite, inasmuch as the finitude of being is an unnatural state of affairs. And therefore the unnatural cannot always be. It tries to overcome and transcend itself and expand itself into the higher stage which moves gradually towards infinitude of realization. Now this tendency of the finitude in us towards the infinite that is really there is the reason behind transmigration, birth and death. What you call birth and death or rebirth, transmigration, metempsychosis, etc. is the necessary obligation on the part of everything that is finite in the light of the all-comprehensiveness of the infinitude. We cannot maintain our individual personalities continuously. As a matter of fact, we cannot be the same individuals even for 2 seconds together. Every moment we change and move and urge ourselves forward in the direction of a larger achievement, finally in the direction of infinitude itself. But because of the fact that our consciousness is tethered somehow or other to this finitude of our body and mind, it appears as if the whole being is changing. And when this change becomes so intense as to make it impossible for the mind to contain it within itself, when the change that is to take place for this purpose becomes very marked in the sense of a total change in the form of this finitude, it appears as if our essential being itself has undergone a process of destruction. There are 2 kinds of changes. That particular series of changes which we pass through every day, as in the case of our growth from babyhood to adulthood, etc., as I mentioned, and the other one which we usually call death. While the constituents of our finitude change in the manner of a growth into a new form altogether, we do not feel this transformation or change in a market manner, because this name and form complex, we call this body, in this space-time world, somehow maintains its particular form of complexity. And as we are living in a world of senses, and the senses regard this body as the self, we do not feel that anything serious has taken place to us, as long as this form is maintained intact. But when the conditions of the process of evolution require a change in the very form of this finitude, and we are to be shifted from one space-time order to another space-time order entirely, it appears there is a total annihilation of personality. Death is a transformation of ourselves from one space-time world to another space-time world. We move from one continuum of space-time to another continuum. It does not mean that the universe is made up of one type of space-time only. This is one particular arrangement of space-time order. And this particular body is in consonance with the requirements of the order of space-time in which we are at present. When the time series and the spatial order changes in the higher ascent of ourselves, the whole physical form has to be shed completely and a new form has to be assumed for this purpose. But inasmuch as our consciousness, this Atman, this soul, is connected with this particular space-time bodily complex, we imagine this total transformation of ourselves from one space-time order to another space-time order as a destruction of ourselves, and as destruction is fearsome, we hate death. Now, therefore, the fear of death is due to a misconception in our minds, on account of a lack of understanding or knowledge of what the universe requires of us. We are not punished by death. We are only educated by it. And the Bhagavad Gita gives a very simple analogy to explain what actually happens in the process of death. We cast off one garment and put on another garment. As we throw off old clothes and put on new clothes, we do not imagine that we have lost something valuable when we cast aside an old garment and put on a new one. Likewise, we should not imagine that there is a real loss in death on account of this process being a necessity, and also because of the fact that we are entering into a new life altogether in the direction of a further enhancement of values, in the direction of a growth of our personalities, because the justice of God shall reign supreme finally. Satyameva jayate. Truth triumphs, and truth cannot. And the truth of the universe shall assert itself, and the assertion of the truth of the universe is the various series of phenomena we see in this world. All change, whatever be its nature, throughout human history, is a requirement of the assertion of the cosmic justice. And birth and death are part of this requirement. So, Arjuna, you are unnecessarily weeping over something in regard to which a wise one will not weep. Birth and death do not become the causes of sorrow to people who are endowed with wisdom. who can see through things and not confine their vision merely to the outer form of the events of the universe. Your sorrow is because of the fact that you have limited your vision to the sense world merely, and you are unable to think in the light of the higher requirement of the law of the cosmos. So, your argument that death may be the undesirable consequence that follow the battle of life is a fallacious argument. And the argument that is positive in the light of the ultimate reality of things will follow. Hari Om.